Hello to everybody that is tuning in for tonight's episode with the Coach's Corner. How are our lovely guests doing?
Good evening.
Good evening. Okay, I'm going to say just a couple words and then I'm disappearing. So for everybody that is watching, please ask questions. Just post them in the comment box. I will keep an eye on the chat and I will drop it into everybody that is on tonight. We will try to get to your questions, try to keep them on topic if at all possible. And if we cannot get to your questions tonight, there will be a link for you to reach out to the Coach's Corner afterwards if you would like to contact everyone there. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this off to you, Duke Sean, to get us started.
Hey, good evening, everyone. I would like to thank everyone for joining us again on the Coach's Corner. We have a really interesting topic for you tonight that we've been discussing for some time on how to approach something like this. It's something we call the elephant in the room. There are a number of subjects that come up through our sport that are kind of touchy and sometimes difficult to talk about. And we are not afraid to talk about those things. Tonight, we're starting with calibration as a general concept. And this is something that affects our sport pretty broadly. Everybody's had experience with good and bad calibration throughout their careers. And this is, it's a subject that can get pretty heated sometimes. We're addressing some of these topics from sort of the Spider-Man axiom of, with great power comes great responsibility. We are trying our best to provide the best training available in our sport to make better fighters. And as you get better in our sport, we have a greater responsibility to pay attention to what's going on with calibration. It's something that comes up, and it's something that people need to be prepared for. We've got a great panel. Some of our regular coaches. We have Duke Eliahu from the mid-realm, Viscount Sagan. And tonight we're especially pleased to have Sir Rauokkin joining us from the Kingdom of Ontario. Many of you will be familiar with the Murder of Duke's interviews that she's been doing for the last few months, where she has interviewed several, 50, 60? Are you up to 60 Dukes now?
60.
Yeah, 60. And I've asked her to be on specifically because in many of those conversations that she's had with a lot of these people that have been around, this is a subject that's come up, and I was really happy to hear her thoughts on that. So I'm going to turn it over to her briefly to kind of recap some of the experience she's had in those conversations and give us some thoughts on that.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Viscount. So I've been talking to a bunch of Dukes over the last couple of months, and one of the questions I always ask is if you could change any rule of the rules of lists, what rule would you change? And inevitably, somebody usually says, people should take their shots. And we talk about, how communication is key and about how we need to work collectively as a culture to change the culture so that we can normalize the calibration conversation. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I've thought about this issue a lot. I work with my husband on it a lot. So I have pretty specific views on calibration and how to deal with it. Sean, did you want me to say anything else?
No, I think that should about cover it, I think.
Cool.
So we wanted to start with some definitions or some examples of ways that calibration could kind of come up. And there's three specific areas that we're going to be talking about a little more in depth. And those are going to be social calibration related to armor, and situational calibration, things that happen in various tournaments. But to start with, we're gonna turn over to His Grace Eliahu, and he's gonna talk about one of the most basic definitions of what this is.
So thank you. So everybody has heard the term rhino, and in fact, maybe we should have called this the rhino in the room instead of the elephant in the room. Somebody who simply won't take their shots. Well, it's been my experience in the many years I've been fighting, in the many kingdoms I've fought in, that there are few people, there are a few, but most of the time, if somebody's hit and they're not taking what the person who threw it thinks is a good blow, it's a matter of perception. It's a matter of differences in expectation of what constitutes a blow that's good, because we persuade each other that we persuade the other person that they've been hit, and part of that is the force with which it's hit. Part is the placement. Part is the awareness that your opponent has of it. Somebody asked a question already about hitting in melee, and that they have to hit harder in melee. And some of the reasons for that are the vast amounts of sensory input that people are getting. They might just not notice something. So how do you deal with rhinos? And I've certainly encountered everything over the years. And there's the question, the hard question is, how do you have a conversation with somebody? And there are lots of issues with having that kind of conversation with an opponent. Some kingdoms don't encourage conversations between fighters. They just say, hey, you know, your blow should speak for itself. Well, that doesn't always work, particularly if there are differences in expectation, such as a kingdom that teaches, if you're not sure if it's good, don't take it, versus a kingdom that says, if you're not sure if it's good, you should take it. And so the biggest thing is to encourage a conversation between people. Most people, when given information and given feedback, will work with each other to find that middle ground where something is acceptable. There are exceptions to that, but most people. Marshals can provide information. Again, there's some kingdoms where the marshals are essentially just constables of the list, and some where they actually provide information. They're trained observers and know what they've seen and can advise the participants what's going on. And but essentially it comes down to this: settle the matter before you leave the list, and then don't talk crap about it afterwards. And that's one of the essential things about it, because every time somebody talks badly about a person, they're not necessarily damaging that person's renown, they're damaging their own. So how we deal with it, and we'll get into some of the more concrete differences and how these differences arise. But the answer, like in so many things, is talk about it and understand why there's a difference there. Now, if you do encounter somebody on that rare occasion, and I have encountered a few, who just, for a number of reasons that we'll get into, simply won't take a blow, and a conversation won't matter, won't make a difference, and the marshals won't have an effect, well, it's just a fight. It's just another fight. I would rather lose a fight than damage my renown. And so if that's the situation, we can deal with it. I prefer to deal with things in the list, but if somebody repeatedly does that sort of thing, then it's an issue for the marshals, and the marshalate has to deal with that as well. So I hope that sets up the framework for at least one of the ways that we can talk about this.
Yeah. And so now we're gonna ask Viscount Sagan to talk about some of the differences that you see kingdom to kingdom. One of the problems that, or one of the ways that calibration can arise when you go to interkingdom events. Sagan.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us. The elephant in the room indicates that we realize that this is a topic that needs to be discussed, and it needs to be discussed openly and frankly. So I started out in the East, went to the West, moved to Aytonville. Now I'm in Artemisia. And so I've had some experience with moving from kingdom to kingdom. My first big exposure was from the East to the West, and there was a dramatic difference when I got to the West. At that time, they hit harder than I was accustomed to. But I've also, over the years, I've heard of kingdoms that take softer. And then everybody goes to Penzik. Well, at Penzik, if there's a bigger inner kingdom mix, I'm not sure how you would find it. And I've heard stories over the years where I've talked to people from softer hitting, accepting kingdoms tell me that they actually have two sets of armor. One that they wear at home, one that they wear at Penzik. And to me, that was quite surprising until I thought about it a bit and went, oh, okay, I get it. So His Grace Eliahu mentioned that in some kingdoms, communication is definitely the way they want you to go, while other kingdoms, they're not, they're not as up for that as the others. The fact of the matter is it comes down to the two fighters in the list at that time. And as His Grace also said, you have a choice to make. So understanding the idea of here we are, the populace is here, their majesties are here, my friends, my family are here, then it comes down to the idea of let's deal with this in a very straightforward manner and let's move on. Let's move on. One fight does not decide a relationship between fighters. And so for me, the inner kingdom differences are there and you need to be aware of them. And that would be something that you would talk to your trainer about so you are prepared. And that's the other one, is be prepared.
Okay. So thank you for that. So those are some of the ways that it's come up. And again, we have three specific items that, or three specific areas that we wanted to address, and we're gonna dig into it a little bit deeper because those are the ones that we seem to see the most of. The first one we're going to talk about is social calibration. By social calibration, I mean when somebody decides that they're not going to take a shot from somebody for essentially social reasons, and that could be that a unbelted fighter who's fighting another unbelted fighter who thinks that they want to show well, and so they want to see the chivalry. They want the chivalry to see them doing well. And so they might alter their calibration. This also comes into play when you're in a in a tournament and you have the, well, I beat that guy at fighter practice all the time, so I don't have to take it this time. There's and one of the other big ones that we see is gender related. We've all heard the stories of somebody who's not going to take a shot from a female fighter because there's no way that girl can hit me hard enough. That is a very real thing, and all these social aspects are in a lot of cases people, and I think this is true of all the calibration issues. Well, not all, but for the most part, many people don't realize that they're doing it. They don't realize that it's happening, and that they're doing it to somebody, that they're making these choices. But it can be very frustrating when an unbelted fighter is cleaning house and they're doing well against even some of the chivalry, and then you run into one of their contemporaries who wants to show like they're doing well, and just can't get that person to take a shot for whatever reason. So as far as social calibration, that's a very real thing. That's one of the ways that this can come up. One of the ways that calibration issues can manifest it themselves. We're going to have Sir Rifkin talk about some of the calibration issues that come up related to armor and equipment. So go ahead, Rifkin.
Yeah, people wear different kinds of armor that you can't feel stuff through. Like they'll have like layers, like their belts on top of their lamellar and the lamellars on top of their zoom bang, and they can't feel anything through there. And they don't even know they're missing stuff. That's not like a true cheating situation. But what's key with that kind of thing is communicating with your opponents. Like if you're trying your new armor or you have something different, to tell them, or that for them to be able to tell you, hey, something's going on with your body tonight. You're not feeling anything. And I think that should happen in practice. Also, a lot of times people wear like tombstone or breastplates, and they'll get hit in the ribs, and it'll push the breastplate down to their hips, and they'll feel it in the hips and not the ribs. That's also a communication thing. You need to tell the person what you're seeing. And once you hear from people that maybe your armor is not telling you, or it's not being honest with you about where you're getting hit or how you're getting hit, you need to do something about it. You have to have ownership over the fact that you have to be able to call a good blow. So also helmets do the same thing. Or you know, if you have a helmet that is super solid, or my husband has an Aventail or a lobster tail on his Roman helmet, and if you move your head a certain way, it deflects the blow, and he just doesn't feel anything. So we have those conversations in practice, and you have to be willing to accommodate your armor choices so that you make good choices, because it is about your renown. And most of us, I think 95% of us want to do the right thing and don't want to cheat and don't want to miss things. So those are some of the ways armor does it. I'm done.
We're just getting started with you.
Oh yeah, that's true.
All right, so now we're going to have Sagan talk about what we're referring to as situational calibration, some of the ways in which calibration can be affected by the situation that you're in.
All right. Thank you, Rifkin. One of the other things that we talk about with the armor and weapons is make sure you check your weapons before you go to the tournament, right? Because if you're hitting somebody with a dead stick, you can't expect them to take it. So situational. This guy has never beat me before, and he's not going to beat me now. Oh, okay. Maybe they're too excited. Maybe this is the Squire or the novice fighter's first tournament, and they are just too excited. It's not that they're cheating intentionally. It's just they're unaware right now for a few minutes or whatever that, you know, hey, you know, I am not as focused as I am at practice. Sometimes too, it depends on the tournament. If it's crown, you know, sometimes that dictates somebody's calibration, where it has to be a bit harder, or I will expect it to be a bit harder. Some of it's, I expect it to be harder because everybody else makes it harder for me. I have to hit them harder. It could be your person's first tournament, right? And they're partially amped up, but they're so focused on exactly what's going on that they're not really aware or there at the moment. Some of it, unfortunately, is, well, this person has never beat me before. They're not going to beat me this time. Some of it is the two opponents are less than friends. And while those are real situations, it is, again, a situation that can be communicated about. And it is a situation that, again, is occurring in front of your friends, your family, the populace, the royalty that's assembled. And so when we talk about this situational things are going to occur, try and prepare in training and practice for those situational instances and any others. But the main thing is learn to communicate well. And in some kingdoms that will be communicating with only your opponent possibly, and some kingdoms that will be communicating with the marshals and your opponent.
Excellent. Thank you, Sagan. So those are some, like I said, pretty broad examples of the different ways that calibration can affect your experience. Mostly that is the place where that is going to manifest most and where it is going to have the greatest impact is in tournament where we want to do well, because that's where we are measured, is in the tournament, and that's usually where that's going to show up. It happens in melee as well. Again, the question was asked earlier about the difference between melee and tournament calibration. And with melee calibration, there's so much going on. There's so much movement that is happening that it's often, people can legitimately not feel being hit by something. And we've all seen tempers flare pretty bad when you're in a melee and you hit somebody and you think it's pretty good, and they just don't feel it. So those being some of the definitions of what calibration can look like. I'd like to talk now about how we as trainers, as coaches, as experienced fighters, how we deal with these sort of things. And you've heard it from all of us so far. Communication is the key. And Rivkin, I'd like to call on you again to talk a little bit more about like normalizing, destigmatizing, and normalizing the conversation, and so that the conversation about calibration is no longer a pejorative.
Sure. So my view on that has several components. One, I think we should be talking about calibration at practice. I think you should want feedback, and you should seek feedback from the people at practice about how hard you're hitting, because none of us actually know how hard we're hitting. We don't get hit by ourselves. So you should be getting feedback all the time. At our practice, we tell each other if we think we're hitting with a 9 or a 7 or a 5. We'll tell each other why we didn't think it was good. So we get all this information at practice that you can use to figure out maybe what you're doing, or maybe what your armor's doing. And if we start talking about it at practice, when you bring something up in a tourney, then it's more normalized. But also, I think if we are going to communicate in a way that is actually effective in tournament, we have to normalize the conversation so that it's not accusatory. Because what often happens is that because we're honor-based, if you ask a question in a tournament, people jump to the conclusion that you're questioning their honor, and then you become a bad loser or whatever. So if we could take the stigma out of asking the question, then we can take the whole dishonor part out of the equation, which I think is super important. Because really, most of us want to do the right thing. And if we can help each other do the right thing, then that is the road we want to go. But also, when you ask a question, you have to be able to, or be willing to live with the answer. There's lots of times people ask the question and then they're like, oh no, I think you didn't hit me. Well, if you ask the question and your opponent gives you feedback, you've got to consider the feedback, or else the conversation deteriorates and there's still emotion, right? Also, I think something else that's important is that we all use the same language. One that happens a lot is somebody will say skippy or whatever, and what they actually mean is that you didn't hit my helmet, it didn't go into my head, it didn't drive in. But other people see that and they think, oh, you get hit hard on the helm, you never have to call it. Well, that's not what we're saying. And so we're teaching people that maybe aren't at the same fighting level as us that some things aren't good, which is not exactly what we're saying. We're saying that you didn't actually move the power through my head, right? So I think if we could come up with a vocabulary that we all know, and we don't use like a million different words to say, you know, the same thing, like it was light, it would go a long way toward normalizing the conversation as well. So we are all on the same page about what we're talking about. Let me see.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about
Sure.
some things you said? So you said in practice, you help each other. You have a conversation. It was a 9, it was a 7, it was a 5. What is good? Where do you put that level? At a 5, at a 6, at a 7, at a where is it a range? And I ask because it's been my experience that in practice, people have a range of what's acceptable. And in tournaments, particularly crown tournaments, that range narrows to a line where it's either good or not good. It's very binary. So in practice, where are you calling, if you're giving it a number, where are you saying it's good?
Well, I think you have to have an understanding with the people at your practice of what that number that is good is. And usually at our practice, it's a 6, I think. But we give each other feedback because like at a practice, I'll be like, I want to throw 9s tonight because I know it's going to take a 9 to get through certain people at Crown. So they'll give me the feedback of when I'm doing it and when I'm not doing it. But we all have an idea of where the 6 is. Or at least I will have an idea when they tell me I'm hitting with a 6, what that felt like for myself. So you do have to, at the beginning of the conversation, define what's good, what's not good, and be willing to assess the feedback, right? Because if you get feedback and you don't do anything with it, it's worthless. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. Well, and Rick, and you know, what you're saying on that leads right into one of the questions that we had from Facebook land. It was, what are your thoughts on acknowledgement, i.e. calling light versus just ignoring a blow? Eli, do you want to cover a little bit more of that?
Yeah, I posted an answer, at least in our chat here, so that at least for me, I always verbally acknowledge the quality of a blow that strikes me. And if it's good, I take it, I fall over, because I like that visual cue for my opponent and for the populace watching. But if it's light or glance, which are the two usual terms, I will say something because I want to give that feedback to my opponent. Similarly, I want them to do the same because that's part of that conversation. Because it also says if I call something a glance, but it actually stuck on me, it may have been, but maybe it was light. Well, maybe there's an armor problem. Maybe why did I feel it was a glance? Is it my perception? Was there something in the way the blow was thrown? Was it my armor? So yeah, I always call it, and I call it loudly enough for the same way I did in authorization. You know, I call it loudly enough for my opponent and the marshals to hear, and ideally for the populace to hear, so that they know I'm not just shrugging it off. And if my opponent disagrees, we can have a conversation. And so I think it's then if I'm marshaling and I see something, what I don't want to see happen is somebody just not acknowledge a blow, and the guy who threw it thinks it was good, and you can tell by their body language, they oh, okay, and you see that determination. I'm really gonna crank up on. Oh, wait a minute here, before things start escalating here, let's just talk to each other. You know, did you think the blow you threw was good? Yes. Did you think you didn't? Oh, I didn't feel it. I don't know what. And I've uncovered armor problems. I've just different, getting them to talk as a marshal, it's the best thing I can do is get them to talk and provide information. And as a fighter, if I verbally acknowledge what's going on, that lets my opponent know of my perceptions. And if they verbally acknowledge, I understand their perceptions, and that's the start of a conversation.
Yeah, I think in Artemisia, we're pretty good about having that regular dialogue, and in a lot of cases, you'll find somebody that throws a blow, because we tend to be more the type that if you have to question whether or not I hit you hard enough, then I don't want you to take that, because I don't have to rip somebody's head off, but I want them to know. I don't want them, that's the other side of the calibration is I don't want my opponent to feel. I want them to know. I don't want them to die to something that I know was not my best blow. And so a lot of times you'll hear some of us saying, I didn't throw that right, or you blocked it, or we're telling people why we're not satisfied with the blow that we delivered, and that happens far more frequently, honestly, in our kingdom than having somebody out there saying, this was light, this was light, this was light. And so for us, when that communication breaks down, and when we have somebody that appears to be getting struck over and over and over again, and they don't say anything at all, that's when we start having problems, and that's where we start raising questions. Because if you just don't like if it's not sufficient force in your mind, then you have to say something, because otherwise, you are going to have people increasing their power. But
it can be a safety issue at that point.
Yeah,
it can be
absolutely.
A safety issue.
Absolutely. Sagan, you've been in our kingdom for a while and traveled broadly. Would you have any other thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things is, again, having been in different places, and the idea of communication is absolutely essential. I've seen where it's great. I've seen where it's not so great. And sometimes that comes down to, it could be the area of a kingdom that each fighter is from. There's a lot of means by you do get to speak, and how you speak is very important, because while you do get to speak, you do not get to interpret how you spoke, right? The person that received the communication is the person that's going to interpret by just the way you said it. If there was an intonation, if it seemed to be an off-shoulder comment with a shrug on their face or something like that, they will interpret things based on the way you said them. Even when that occurs, however, give them their due. This is another fighter. This is someone that you agreed to meet in the list, and give them their due, and understand that, sometimes we're better at tournament than today. Sometimes we're better at melee. Sometimes we're better at war. And just give them their due. And again, communicate. It sounds very simple, and at its core, it is.
Yeah, I think, as Rifkin was kind of alluding to, as I said earlier, the key to it is that we need to make it so that the conversation of calibration is not pejorative. It's not an accusation. It's not, it's not, we get away from this idea that having somebody ask you about a shot that landed is not a character assault.
One of the things that we often say is that I'm not questioning your honor. I'm helping you safeguard your honor. And you are helping me safeguard mine. And that conversation is not questioning honor. It's keeping each other's honor intact.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
So I also want to say that when I ask a question, it's not only for my opponent, it's for my benefit. I'm asking what I did wrong, so that the blow wasn't good, which is really good feedback for me and education for me, because we don't always understand exactly what's happening in the fight. I mean, lots of times, you'll think you hit someone low and then you'll watch the video and it's way up on their butt or something. And so when we give each other feedback, and we ask for feedback, it's not always a question about the opponent and the opponent doing something wrong. It's a question about what can I do better? And if we can look at the conversation through that lens, I think that would also sort of destigmatize the conversation.
Sagan? You muted.
Oh, you're muted.
I am. You guys all
Yeah.
passed the test. Congratulations. As you've already seen, the common thread through all of this is, if you can, de-escalate, but you absolutely should. And, you really need to communicate.
Yeah, and somebody had also made a comment. Sorry, I'm trying to get back to that, about letting the audience know, letting the spectators know. So a lot of that communication is, there's I mean, honestly, 90% of the people that are at Crown Tourney are there to be spectators. There's, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the people that are present that are invested in that tournament at all, and that's the fighters and the consorts. Vast majority of the people that are there are there to watch, especially Crown Tournament. That is our big display, and 90% of the people that are there are, for lack of a better phrasing, kind of victims to the whole process. And as the crowns of Qaid say on the inside, you rule because they believe, and a lot of that belief is we have a system that we have used for 50 plus years to choose our monarchs, and that system relies on a self-calibrating system where everybody calls their own shots on their own honor. And in order for that system to work, everybody has to be on board and has to take things as honestly as they can. And when that system fails, and when somebody ends up taking the highest position of honor in our society in questionable circumstances, that system fails pretty broadly, and it is very difficult to recover the faith in that system. And so a big part of this is making sure that the spectators understand what's going on, because many of them don't fight. Many of them don't know what a skippy blow or a glancing blow it looks like, or many of them don't know what it's like to take a super clean shot that just has no power. And so we have to be clear throughout the list, not just for ourselves, not just for our opponent, but for the people who are relying on us to get that system right. So yeah, that was a comment that was posted in the chat there that I think is definitely worth mentioning. I mean, we are doing this for them, the spectator, the populace at large, and so we have to get that right. And that means we need to be as clear as we can in our communication with each other in that list to make sure that we remove as much doubt as possible.
Your Grace, if I may.
Yes, please.
One of the things that we've been talking about, especially in situational awareness, is the situation. You're at Crown. Well, I'm going to use the Crown example. Well, when you're at Crown and you walk onto that field, you're not just carrying your honor with you. You're carrying the honor of your consort, you're carrying the honor of your household, carrying the honor of your friends and family. You're carrying the honor of the royalty present. And the last thing I believe that any of us want to do is besmirch any of that. And our actions on the field have an effect. There are, as His Grace said, quite a few people in attendance who are watching what's going on. And if an escalation starts to take place and you de-escalate it, that's one thing. If it escalates and you keep the escalation going, that's another. So one of the other reasons to be aware of needing to communicate is that you are going to have an effect on people one way or another.
Yep. So, let's talk. So we've got several comments coming out there in the Facebook land, which is some really good comments. We had. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if. Well, it's a different question. So sorry about that. I was trying to follow along with some of the questions we had there. So let's talk a little bit about how we teach this to our students in particular, and how to address it when it happens to them. How to listen better when somebody brings it up to them as well. So Rifkin, you want to start with that? How do you teach your students to be aware of this and how to deal with it when it happens to them and when they're doing it to others?
Okay, well, like I've said before, I'm a huge proponent of communication. We communicate maybe overly so in practice, so that maybe we don't have to communicate in tournament, because I understand why people don't want to ask questions in tournament. It breaks the fight, it breaks up the flow. But anyway, so I make sure that we all understand that communication is super important, that we all need the feedback, both from a standpoint of what you may be doing wrong, that your blow's not being taken, or from the standpoint of what you might be missing because your armor's too good or you have too much adrenaline, or whatever. Two, I think you also always have to have a plan on how you're going to deal with a calibration issue in a tourney. This is a hard one lesson for me. But I think you have to have a plan, and I teach my students, you have to have a plan on how to divorce your emotion from what's going on in the fight and to accept the answer. So having a plan on how that works for you is important. Let's see, what's the other one? And we also give each other a lot of feedback, like I was talking earlier about how hard we're hitting. I spent about 3 years just concentrating on power generation so I could hit at a 9 at will. So that's another thing. We're very cognizant of perfect technique so that you can hit well, and of communicating. Like somebody asked why it's important that you say the why. Why it's important that you say the why is so that your opponent understands what they did that didn't work, or that you understand what's wrong with your armor, or that you may have a dead spot somewhere. If you don't have the why, then the information's not very useful. We also do drills at practice where I think we call it like the never dead drill, where we don't call blows until you decide you're done fighting. And then we'll tell each other which blows actually hit well, because one of the things that we're super bad about in practice, everybody, I think, is stopping and admiring our work when we think we've finished. And you know what? You're never finished until your opponent tells you you're finished. So doing drills at practice like that, where you're not done with the fight, you keep throwing blows until your opponent tells you you're done with the fight, has been hugely helpful as well.
Cool. Very cool. We actually had a question that came up that I think I'm going to pass over to Sagan. It's at what point do you think it is acceptable for a marshal to step in and tell somebody they are cheating? I don't know if I'd quite put it that way, but this is something that Sagan had talked about recently, as far as we have that we have that dichotomy where we are expected to respect the blows that somebody, judge fairly and honestly the blows dealt to me, and respect my opponent's opinion. So I mean, it's kind of a two-edged sword there. So it's just Sagan, I'm gonna let you talk in there. When do we, as experienced fighters and marshals, when do we step in?
It is one of those things that we've talked about. Different kingdoms have different viewpoints. As a marshal, I am an observer in some kingdoms. I am not a definitive source of who's a cheater and who isn't. However, as a senior marshal, if I become aware of an individual that I believe needs to be, shall we say, watched more appropriately or more closely, I will bring that attention to the Earl Marshal if he's a crown, or the senior marshal of the event. Is it ever appropriate for a marshal on the field to tell someone point blank they're cheating? No. However, there are ways, having been a marshal for a very long time, that I can infer, I can provide enough information that I believe the choice is made easier. Again, here we are, we're at a tournament, there's a lot going on. And unless we absolutely feel something is a safety matter, then I don't believe the marshal would ever be allowed to say you're cheating, unless there are definitive marshalate kingdoms. And to this point, I am not aware of one. I have heard over the years of fighters being assigned definitive marshals, and that marshal is watching every one of their fights, and whatever the marshal says goes. That is less than an optimal situation, especially at a crown tournament. And again, with communication from the marshal and the two fighters, I believe there's a way to work it out.
Eli, do you have something on this as well?
So I've also marshaled for a long time and marshaled crown tournaments as well. And I know some people have viewed what I call informative marshaling as determinative marshaling. And I don't consider it that. You're providing information. There've only been a handful of situations, less than a handful, two maybe, in over the many decades I've been marshaling, where I've had to tell somebody that the blows that struck them were good, because it became a safety issue. The challenge for the marshals is to balance informing the fighters with not seeming to put social pressure on them, but allowing them, giving them enough information to make a choice that will be respected by people, that will add to their renown rather than to their infamy. So, and I think that it's in the same way it's possible for somebody who doesn't know how to have the conversation, a fighter, to try to question their opponent into victory. I call it whining to victory, by saying, what about that? What about that? What about that? Is the marshals can help stop that as well. The marshals can also help provide information so that the marshals can say, well, here's what we saw. And when I'm marshaling a fight, I always ask the person who threw it first, because if they say, no, I wasn't good, which I think, to Duke Sean's point, yeah, if you want to have that mutual respect with your opponent, you have to also be honest enough, exhibit the virtue of veritas on the field and say, no, what I threw wasn't good. Don't take it. So if you do that, that's good. But somebody who's always questioning can be perceived as trying to negotiate their way to victory instead of simply winning the fight. The marshals can help with that. The marshals can help provide information and say, okay, here's what we saw. And when you think about it, somebody who's been fighting, who's been marshaling, who's been doing it for as long as all of us have, is a pretty knowledgeable observer and can see, okay, that, you know, that there was sufficient motion, sufficient body mechanics. It didn't continue past the target. It stuck on the target. It wasn't flat. It was edge on. It wasn't blocked. It didn't skip off. You can see all that, and you can provide that information. And generally, I'd say an overwhelming number of times, you provide that kind of information to somebody, they'll say, "Oh, I didn't realize it. Thank you." And they'll thank you, and they'll thank their opponent. And so many examples of where this has happened, where someone didn't realize that they were butt spiked in the face in a crown tournament fight with pollards, and they didn't realize it, and they were resetting to start it. Well, I went to the opponent, the person who threw the blow, and he said, "Yeah, oh yeah, I'm sure I butt spiked him in the face." And the other guy's, "Oh, I didn't realize what happened. I just thought I got halved it." Great, I'll take it. Terrific, because if that conversation hadn't happened, now the force escalates, and now the guy who threw it thinks the other guy is intentionally ignoring it instead of just not really realizing what's going on. So I think I've answered the question and kept talking, but
Yeah, I think we had Sagan next on that.
okay.
Well, when it comes to training, okay, so we've already addressed there's training, there's practice, and there's combat. You really want all of this worked out before you get to the combat stage. You can do drills. You can tell people, here's what's going to happen tonight. There are going to be times where you are going to be confronted by your opponent at any given spot in a fight in different ways, calmly, not so calmly, and angrily. And the idea of this lesson, this drill, is to respond as if you were at a tournament, if you were at a war. Doesn't really matter. It is down to two people having a discussion. And a lot of times at first, it's easy because it's a drill, right? Well, then you do it at practice. And I would enlist someone who is not one of my students, and I would have them do the same thing. And then after the first occurrence, I would inform the trainee that this is what we drilled on. And the idea is that, again, you from my point of view, in my humble opinion, never assume that it's the other fighter. If your weapon isn't up to snuff, right? If it's turned to mush, or it's on its way there, then you need to take that responsibility on. Just because you felt it good, maybe it wasn't, right? Maybe did you catch their shield edge, but it looked like it struck. There are so many different things that you can actually do in a practice. Teach them to communicate appropriately. In other words, when something occurs that is untoward, either towards them or they want to talk to somebody, there should not be any anger in it. Whether or not their opponent is angry, well, that's up to them. Teach them to respond appropriately. If their opponent says it's no good, you don't go, "Oh, geez." You teach them that their very demeanor can determine the outcome of the conversation. And again, in the end, we want the communication to be successful. on both sides, and that the fight ensues or the fight ends. And for that, we do have ways to train. You need to teach, again, in that same vein, that take the higher road. You know, as His Grace Eliahu mentioned, this is just one fight. And, you know, take the higher road. If you are questioned, you know, then okay, then go through a little list of, well, how did you feel the force was? You know, continue the conversation instead of just going, no. Again, you know, whatever you do, whether it's a body mannerism or however you say whatever you're going to say, it will affect the outcome. So it's as simple as it sounds. Even from a training standpoint, a lot of it comes down to communication, but also, you know, your armor, your weapons, everything needs to be prepared, you know, a week in advance or 2 weeks in advance. So the weapon isn't unfamiliar to you. Do you know the weapon is well maintained? Your armor fits properly. And so you are as prepared as you can, both mentally and physically, to go to tournament.
You're on mute.
You're muted.
So there we go. So yeah, that actually leads right into another question that that came up from the Facebook land. You know, if regarding, you know, what should you do? So if we're if you saw the blow hit, you felt the blow, and you felt it was light, should you just take the blow because the marshal said so? And I think we're going to have Rivkin answer this one first, and I've definitely got some thoughts on that myself.
I have some thoughts on it as well.
Okay, well, I come from a kingdom that not only do we not have determinative marshaling, we don't have active marshaling. So this would never happen in my kingdom. But that said, I think perception is important. But what I think should happen before you decide one way or the other is there should be communication between you and your opponent. Because your opponent might say, you know what, you're right. That was not a good blow. I know that wasn't a good blow. We're all good here, right? Mm-hmm. Or they could say, yeah, I think I hit you. I think for me, the only situation that this would happen in my kingdom would be for the king to come out on the field or the knights. And if that happened, I would absolutely 100% die. My honor is more important to me than winning a fight. Yeah. And perception to me is important. This is a choice, though. You can choose not to put as much importance on perception as I do. But I think before you get to that, you got to make sure you've gone through the communication with your opponent and that you're both on the same page. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have come off the field and said, oh, I can't believe you took that blow. I didn't think it was good. It's like, well, why didn't you tell me it wasn't good? You know, like, let's talk about that too. Like, if you don't think you delivered a good blow, don't let your opponent take it. So somebody else can.
You know, it's funny you should end with that, because that happened to me early on, and it is something that was very formative in my decision-making process, especially regarding how the blows that I deliver to my opponent, because I had the same thing where I was in a crown tourney and I took a blow because I wanted to do my best to take it. And when we got done, this person said, well, I just didn't think that was that good. I'm like, well, why would you let me take something that you know is not your best work, is not sufficient? And again, I don't need somebody to rip my head off, and I don't need to you know, bury somebody. But you know, I have done it. I've done it in crown tourney. I've done it in every list I've been in, where I've hit somebody with somebody that, you know, I'm not one to tell somebody that I think I killed you. But to me, I know when it just doesn't feel right in my hand. And I know when I hit flat. I know when I caught too much of shield. You know, all these things, and I don't want somebody to you know, as much as we don't want to be cheated, I don't want to cheat my opponent either. I don't want them to take a blow that I know was insufficient. That was not my best work. That because part of that for me is also the idea that I don't need to have you rip my head off in order for me to know that I'm just beaten and just bested. That's a different topic, I'm sure, but that's kind of how I look at it. Is sometimes you just know that you're beaten, and it's not a matter of force, because again, part of calibration and part of the system that we use is that convincing your opponent that they're bested, that they're dead. As somebody once put it, this is the only sport that we know of where you don't actually win anything. You are always granted victory by your opponent. It's your opponent that ultimately gets to decide that. But I have had my honor questioned in at the worst possible circumstance, and when that happened to me, I folded like a cheap suit, honestly, because I am not going to win crown under any suspicion if I can at all avoid it. And even if I didn't think that, and that was a situation where I did not think that I had been hit sufficiently, and I was not bested. But when my opponent decided that they had something to say about it, I gave it up, and I did it without hesitation. I would do it all over again. And it's hard to say that every time somebody questions a blow that you should just take it, because I don't think that's the case at all. You have to weigh things out, but you have to be open to that conversation, because if you're not open to that input in that conversation, then that leads to trouble for you, for the system, for your kingdom in general. So, Eliahu.
Yeah. And I promise I'll try to keep it brief. Regarding the original question, was about if you didn't think it was good and the marshal tells you it was good, should you take it? But that's not, when I talk about informative marshaling, that's not how that works. I think I've only in 40 years called somebody dead twice. And then it was a safety issue because they weren't capable of acknowledging a blow. A marshal doesn't call a blow good. A marshal says, I can comment on where it landed, whether it was flat or oriented correctly, whether it was blocked or not blocked, whether it moved past the target or whether it landed. The fighter has to decide on whether the force was sufficient. I can give them all the other information and say, it may not have, and I've done this with fights when two fighters were going at it and we're so focused on hitting the other person, they were just not paying attention to what was landing. And I'd stop and I'd say, hey, I'm seeing a lot of stuff. It may not be great, but just keep in mind, you guys aren't blocking. You aren't blocking anything. So pay attention, just take a couple of breaths, calm down, and fight a good fight that you know how to fight, and pay attention to what's going on, and usually cleans up the fight thereafter. I'm not telling them this was good, that wasn't good. I'm providing them with information that they may not be perceiving. And that's what informative marshaling is. It's not determinative, and it only becomes determinative when it's a safety issue. So just to clarify that.
So there was another question that came up. How much does shot placement matter compared to raw power? As a trainer, I would train you to leave no doubt. Now, what that is from my standpoint is pick higher percentile targets, pick high percentile blows, shots that you can accomplish, and accomplish them. When you are in question, one of the side notes to this is usually if I hit a person high on the helmet, I tell them not to take it. That depends on the type of helmet. And of course, on a pot helmet, it's way different than something like a sugar loaf. But raw power can get the job done to a certain extent, while a shot placement, again, done very well, leaves no doubt. And His Grace Sean, as I've observed over the years, has developed that skill that, again, there should be no doubt as to the blow, its force, and whether or not the opponent takes it is up to them. Because I can pretty much guarantee you that, as I have done with my trainees, I assure them that they can do it again.
Yeah, that's one of those things that's always kind of. I've never really had a problem with calibration. People taking my shots, and you know, and I am definitely one of those people that believes that if somebody doesn't take something I threw, it's because I didn't do my job right. I didn't execute the blow right, and if my skill is sufficient, then I'll be able to hit that shot as many times as necessary. And if my opponent strikes a good blow on me before I get a chance to strike a blow on them, then I have a problem with my defense, and that's something I can go home and work on. And you know, I don't know, you know, that kind of philosophy could potentially could be a can of worms. And the question has been raised: is that potentially enabling somebody to be a cheater? And I don't think that's true, and I don't know for sure. But what I can tell you is that for me personally, taking responsibility on myself has saved me a lifetime of heartbreak and anguish on, you know, whether or not somebody cheated me out of a tournament in the 80s. So that's kind of how I look at it. I want to do my job better. We had another question that came up. What would the aftermath look like if repeated increases in intensity lead to a real world injury requiring medical intervention? And I think, Rauokkin, did you want to follow up on that, or did you want the one previous to that?
The one previous, I didn't really want to answer that, but
Right.
I just wanted to say, as somebody who has felt like I've had socially adjusted calibration due to my gender, I understand the frustration of feeling like you can't do it again, and that you know, that is a philosophy that feels very frustrating to a lot of people. And I just want to acknowledge that you have to take personal responsibility, but also, you know, part of the game, everyone, is acknowledging when someone bested you and giving people their props when they do something that you don't expect. When you steal people's victories, you rob the whole game of everything. So I think it's super important to emphasize that, yes, you have personal responsibility, but that is also part of that is calling the blows and accepting an outcome that maybe you don't like.
One of the other things that was specified specifically in this question is a real world injury. Whenever anybody is injured on the field, in most kingdoms, what happens is a review of exactly what happened. Because as their graces have alluded to in prior conversation here, when it becomes a safety matter, things change, and they change dramatically and immediately. Unfortunately, I have been the marshal in charge on fields where this type of thing has occurred. Handled correctly and immediately, it has the effect of showing that the marshal is active. On the other hand, it also shows one of the darker sides of our sport, especially if it was identified or interpreted by the populace that that injury was intentional. Once again, we're going to go back. We're going to say if things start escalating, de-escalate as much as possible. If they're escalating and nobody's talking, then be the one to speak. Because this is one of those situations that over the years have been very disappointing and discouraging to me.
Yeah, and you know, the reality is it should never get to that. And we've seen it, but it should never get to that. You know, I also kind of fall into the camp of, you know, as far as what to do about somebody that seems like they don't want to take a blow. You know, the easy answer has always been, you know, well, how do you deal with a rhino, right? The easy answer has always been hit them harder. And my answer has always been, I don't hit them harder, I hit them better. I hit them in a place that is unobstructed, that gives me a better mechanic, that is less defensible. You know, pick a spot, make it soft. You know, maybe you hit them in a spot that's a little less armored, which again could also lead to injury. Don't hit them harder, hit them better. You know, I mean, part of that too is that your efforts to try to put more muscle behind it to try to hit somebody harder actually throws off your technique. Yes. And so if you throw with better technique and you hit cleaner, and again, if you can do it once, you can do it over and over again. But don't hit harder, hit better, because that keeps us from increasing those injuries. And as somebody who has, you know, I've been on both sides of this coin, right? You know, the question that we asked earlier is like this dichotomy of, we're supposed to allow our opponents to judge their blows, and we're supposed to call ours fairly and honestly. And what do you do when that doesn't happen? For me, I don't question my opponent's judgment while I'm in a fight. I feel in a lot of ways, and again, a lot of that is because I know that I can deliver whatever I need to. And quite frankly, I've had the finals of Crown where I threw a shot that I thought felt really, really good. My opponent didn't take it, and you know, that could have I could have just kind of done a death spiral there and just lost my shit and just thrown a fit about it. But I took just a moment to allow my opponent to respect that and just kind of blow it off and keep going. And I ended up winning. And when I looked back on the video later, I was able to clearly see why my opponent didn't take that blow. So you're not always right in what you deliver. And so being able to do that, being able to let that go, I try not really hard not to question my opponent. If they ask me, I'll tell them. I'll tell them what I thought. I'll tell them where it landed. I'll tell them it was clean. You know, somebody, well, you know, I think I blocked that. Well, you didn't block any of it. It totally hit you, but you know, you can call it however you want. However, I have, as a spectator, as a marshal, I have called out shots that, you know, especially from, you know, people that have been known to have a history with this sort of thing. Yes, I have stopped the fight and I said, hey, you got hit there. And again, it was well, I thought I blocked it. Nope, didn't block any of it. So you call it however you want, but you didn't block any of that. I try really hard not to interject and offer my opinion in a tournament that I'm still involved in. So if I'm in a Crown tournament and I'm watching from the sidelines in a list that I'm still in and I'm going to be fighting next, I don't want to carry the impression of influencing the list by saying, well, I think that guy's cheating. So I'm very hesitant to do that. But sometimes, you know, I have had circumstances in the list where I've been in where I saw something and I had to say something. You just can't not. But as a marshal, as a spectator, yeah, I've stopped the list, and I've told somebody that you get hit. What they do with that information after that is up to them. But again, those are two different sides of how I approach it. Because if I'm in the list, again, I'm not going to let somebody take something that I know is insufficient. And I'm going to let them call it as best I can because I have the faith in my skill to to be able to hit them better. So let's see.
Part of better is placement. Force is, there are lots of components in convincing, persuading your opponent that it was good, because as Duke Sean said, it's about our opponent deciding if we've won. And force is only one of those. And we did an episode on feints and fakes. And if you can maneuver your opponent so they're expecting it here and it's actually here, and you have completely beaten them and it's sufficient force, but you have planted it where their guard was not, you have convinced them that they've been beaten, and generally that is sufficient. And that's one of the reasons why I like feints and fakes quite a bit. It's very persuasive.
So it looks like we have one more question that came up. It is hard enough to talk about blow calibration amongst equals. How would you suggest an unbelted address an issue with a belted fighter who only takes blows that are well above what is typical? Anybody want to jump on that?
Sure.
Go ahead, Sagan.
All right. So as we spoke of before, there are individuals whose calibration is higher, and there are individuals whose calibration is lower. The trick to this question is, how do you suggest an unbelted issue is dealt with a knight or anybody who has a higher calibration? Once again, it's communication. However, if you go into combat with an individual where it is understood that they have a higher calibration, then it is a point of discussion. It is a decision on your part as to which avenue you will take. Again, this is one of those things that we've seen over the years. And it is, again, one of those things where usually the fighter with a higher calibration isn't cheating. It's just who they are. And now it comes down to, well, what if I can't hit them hard enough to satisfy them? Well, once again, you can have the discussion with them, and you can, again, in some kingdoms, you can bring the marshal into that discussion. Ultimately, here we are again, it is a decision point. And if you feel that you are being somehow cheated upon, again, I really, really think you should communicate. Again, if it's understood going into the fight that this fighter has a higher calibration and you know that, then it is, again, up to you as to what you're going to do about that. I mean, if you try and increase the power, that's one thing. Again, as Eliahu and I have both said, blow placement speaks a lot. It speaks a lot louder in that it can't be ignored when successful. So it is a tough question. It is one of those questions that comes up over the years. And again, it is hard to allay any fears you might have about being cheated upon when confronted with this fighter.
Excellent. So we are about an hour and a half in, so we're probably going to wrap up here. One thing that we wanted to point out is we knew going into this this particular episode that this was going to be it's a touchy subject, and that was kind of the point of it. Is that we wanted to tackle some of these issues that come up, because calibration in particular is one that is kind of talked about in the shadows, and we need to not do that. For the sake of for our honor, your opponent's honor, and for the sport at large. So Eliahu, you got some final thoughts?
Talk to each other, you know, and if that doesn't work, it's the same thing I would recommend to people in a social situation, a situation not on the list. If you think you have a problem with somebody, your first thing should be to talk to them. to find out if it's really a problem. And if you have that conversation, it often resolves it. If you can't resolve it there, you can bring in a mediator or a marshal to help facilitate that conversation. Assuming the worst of somebody usually is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So don't do that. And then when the rare, and I do mean rare example of a bad actor happens, that can be dealt with. And that the point, I think a lot of what we're talking about is that's really doesn't happen that much. It's usually a lack of communication.
Sagan?
Well, stuff happens. Always has, always will. How you deal with it will differentiate you one way or another from others. One of the main things that you do need to be aware of is if you do feel you have a grievance with any given fighter, you should consult with the marshal at a kingdom and principality level and find out what processes and procedures they have in place that address this type of thing. One of the things you will probably be informed of in most of the kingdoms I've been in is that you are expected to, again, communicate with the individual in question, and you will probably be asked to provide the outcome of that conversation. And if you haven't had that conversation, you've probably missed a really primary step to getting it resolved. In the end, here we are, we're talking calibration, and we've already in this time frame, we've discussed so many different things, and there are so many different aspects we haven't even gotten to yet. But again, my final word was, when in doubt, communicate.
And to our special guest this evening, we'd like to thank Rauokkin. We'd like to get some final thoughts here.
Yeah, I wanted to add something about calling out the person who's ranked higher than you. I'm going to be really, really honest here. Speaking from my experience, the Shiv Council doesn't do as good a job as we should about policing our own and taking care of or dealing with the fighters who are outside the accepted norm of calibration. I think each kingdom has one or two, and we don't deal very well with them. And that's on us, and we need to do better. But one thing I would like to say about that is, one thing I like to do with somebody like that is turn it into a teaching situation where I become the student and I ask them, look, I'm having a really hard time with you. Our styles don't mesh well. Teach me how to kill you. And this is obviously not a tournament situation, but so when you turn it around on them like that and make it into a situation that's non-confrontational, it's a teaching situation, I find that the communication is better. And really, calibration is all about trust. And it's about building trust, not breaking trust. And communication goes so long, such a long way in making sure that the trust stays intact and rebuilding trust once it's broken. So that's sort of my end thing, is just communication and at practice, just make sure you're communicating, like getting feedback and not divorce your ego out of the whole equation and take the feedback, either whether it's about what you're doing as technique or about how you're calling, and run with it and just get better. Like, take it and get better.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, especially those out in Facebook land following along. We've had some pretty good engagement. There are many, many comments on this particular subject out there, and we always know that we can't get to all the questions that come up. Just not a lot of time for everything. But We will be going through the comments and responding to those. So please pay attention to that to follow along. This is a subject that here at the Coach's Corner, we knew we're not going to be able to address in one episode. I mean, there's so much to this, and the reality is there is no easy answer. And so if you have any more comments on this, we'll be soliciting input on this on the Coach's Corner. We may do another episode of this covering different aspects of this if there's interest in there. But definitely post up on the Coach's Corner if you have any further questions. And again, we'll be going through the comment section on the video here, and we'll address those as best we can. So again, we'd like to thank everybody. We know we knew going into this that this was a huge topic, but there's this, and along these same lines, the elephant in the room. If there's other topics you wanna hear us talk about, we're happy to do that. That's not the primary function of why we're here. We're here to make people better fighters and to increase the evolution of our sport and to make better fighting accessible to everybody. And that's what we're here for. And this is a part of that. If you want to be a better fighter, if you're going to be a successful fighter in our sport, these are issues that are going to come up. So if you have something that you want to talk about or you want us to talk about, please feel free to put that out there. Thanks again for the questions as always. Once again, Sagan, Eliahu, thank you for joining me on this one. Sir Rauokkin, thank you for allowing me to badger you into to coming on. I just really loved the way that conversation went in your interviews, and as something that had come up quite a bit, I wanted you to be part of this conversation.
Thank
So,
you.
and always, our producer, Vesper, we are always grateful for you keeping us on track and getting these things running and fielding questions for us. So you're a pretty huge part of what makes this whole thing tick. So thank you as always for your input.
Yay, thank you all. Thank you so much for all of this knowledge and information you're sharing. And next week, another new episode. So everybody be sure to check in. I will post a link over to the Coach's Corner.
And I think that's Sagan. So Sagan, you want to tell us what we're doing next week?
What are we doing next week?
A 5 on each side?
Oh, that thing.
You know that thing you've been talking to me about for a quarter century?
Yeah, well, hey, yes, we are going to revisit one of my earlier epiphanies in training people, and that was the identification of the facets of offense and defense and how to effectively train them, practice them, and then ultimately take them into combat.
So, yep, definitely looking forward to that one. That has been something that was definitely an eye opener for me when Sagan first started talking to me about it, and it has become a pretty core component of what I teach in my training classes as well. That's brilliant in its simplicity, and just one of those things that I know when I talk about these things that I refer to as universal principles of combat. Everywhere I go, it's just remarkable to me how people have never heard of these things before, and when they do, they're like, "Oh yeah, that just totally makes sense." So definitely looking forward to that, and got several other episodes lined up. A couple other folks that we're looking to have a conversation with. I know at the end of September, I think the week after that, we will be having a conversation with Duke Craven from the Kingdom of Adenbelt, talking to him about his training methodology and his fighting philosophy. And I'm sure somewhere in there, we're going to ask him about the sombrero block. That's got to be mentioned.
It's your move.
So, but anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks for the questions and the comments. Please feel free to contact us in the Coach's Corner and let us know what you're thinking, so we can help you all be better fighters. So thanks again, everybody.
Have a good night.
everybody.
Bye.